My husband put me on the table like I was a poker chip. Not money, not jewelry, not the car or the apartment or anything else he had already lost that night. Me, his pregnant wife. 6 months along, standing in a room full of dangerous men, wearing a coat I had buttoned over my stomach because I wanted to protect the one person in that room who had no idea what was happening. His name was Daniel, and I had loved him with everything I had. But the man sitting across from him at that table, the man who watched my husband try to gamble me away, the man everyone in Seoul whispered about and nobody dared to cross, Kang Ji-ho, he looked at me in a way Daniel hadn't in over a year. He looked at me like I mattered, and what happened next changed every single thing about my life. My name is Grace Williams, and I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I was not a woman who took risks. I was not careless or naive or the kind of person who ignored warning signs. I was a secondary school English teacher from Atlanta, Georgia, who believed in hard work and quiet faith and the idea that if you loved someone genuinely enough, they would eventually rise to meet that love. I was wrong about that last part. But I didn't know it yet when Daniel walked into my life. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon and I was sitting in a coffee shop near my school, gradding papers, minding my own business, when he appeared at my table like he had been invited. He had this smile, the kind that made you feel like the room had gotten warmer, and he said I looked like someone who needed better coffee. I told him to leave. He didn't. And 3 hours later we were still talking and I had forgotten all about the papers I was supposed to be gradding. That was Daniel. He had a way of making the world shrink down to just him and you, and for a long time that felt like the most beautiful thing in the world. Within 6 months he proposed. Within a year we were married. Within 2 years he had convinced me to leave everything I knew and move with him to Seoul, South Korea, where he promised we would build a life more beautiful than anything either of us had dreamed of back home. I believed him. I packed my books and my teaching certificates and my whole heart, and I followed my husband to a city where I didn't speak the language and didn't know a soul, because I trusted him completely. And for a little while he was right. Seoul was extraordinary. The city at night looked like something out of a film, all light and motion and energy. We had a small apartment in Mafia with a window that overlooked the Han River, and some evenings we would sit by that window and I would think, this is it. This is the life. The first lie was small, a bill I wasn't supposed to find tucked behind some papers in his desk drawer. A loan I didn't know existed. I brought it to him and he laughed the way he always did when I worried too much, kissed my forehead and said, I'm handling it, Grace, don't stress yourself, so I let it go. But the lies didn't stay small. They grew the way things do when nobody stops them. Hidden loans became missing money, became nights he didn't come home until 3 in the morning smelling like cigarettes, and somewhere expensive I had never been. Every time I pushed for answers he gave me that same smile and those same words. I'm handling it, but he wasn't handling anything. He was gambling, every night, every chance he got. And he was losing everything we had, piece by piece, while I sat at home growing our daughter inside me, and believing in a man who had already decided we were his last card to play. The night it all fell apart started like any other. Daniel came home around 7 looking like a man who had been running from something all day. His eyes were too fast, his hands wouldn't stay still. Get dressed, he said. We're going out. I was 6 months pregnant, my feet ached. The last thing I wanted was to go anywhere. Where are we going, I asked. He said just get dressed, something nice with the tone of someone who had already decided the answer didn't matter. Something cold moved through me when he said it, some instinct I should have listened to. But I got dressed anyway. I put on the long black dress that still fit over my stomach and wrapped myself in a coat and told myself it would be fine. We took a taxi to Gangnam. I had only been to that part of Seoul a few times, and it always made me feel like I had walked into a different world entirely. All gleaming surfaces and luxury cars and people who looked like they had never once worried about anything. Daniel led me to a building I had never noticed before, tall and dark glassed with no signage outside. And when the doors opened the air that hit me was heavy and warm and thick, with the kind of tension that lives in places where people wager things they cannot afford to lose. The ground floor was elegant. Chandeliers and low music and staff who moved so quietly you almost didn't see them. But Daniel didn't stop there. He guided me past a security checkpoint and up a staircase to a private room on the upper floor. And when those doors opened, I understood immediately that I was somewhere I was never supposed to be. There was a single large table at the center of the room, cards and chips and men in expensive suits arranged around it. And at the head of that table sat a man who made every other person in the room seem somehow smaller just by existing. I didn't know his name yet. I only knew that nobody in that room moved without first being aware of exactly where he was. He sat with the kind of stillness that isn't relaxed, it's controlled, the stillness of a man who has decided that nothing is worth reacting to unless he chooses to react. Black suit, no tie, a silver watch on his left wrist, a face that was younger than his presence suggested, maybe mid-30s, with eyes that were dark and completely unreadable. When he finally looked up from his cards, he didn't look at Daniel. He looked at me, just for a second. Just long enough for me to feel it somewhere in my chest, then he looked away, and the game began. I sat near the wall and I watched my husband lose everything. The first game gone, the second gone, the money went first, then his watch, which had been a gift from his father. Then the car papers, then the documents for our apartment. Hand after hand after hand, I watched Daniel push forward things that belonged to both of us, things I had never agreed to wager, and lose them without looking back at me once. I pressed my hand against my stomach and the baby kicked, soft and certain, and I thought, pay attention, Grace. Something in you already knows what is happening here. When Daniel had nothing left, I stood up. I said his name quietly. I said we need to leave. He didn't even turn around, just one more hand, he muttered. And that was when I understood. He wasn't here chasing a win. He was here because these people already owned him, and tonight was the night the debt had come due. The final round settled over the room and Daniel reached into his jacket and came up with nothing, and for a long, terrible moment the room just waited. And then he said the words that ended our marriage as surely as any court document ever could. I still have something valuable, he said, and he didn't look at me when he said it. She stays with you until I repay everything, Daniel said. His voice was barely above a whisper. She is collateral. The silence that followed was the most complete silence I have ever stood inside. Not one person moved. One of the dealers looked down at the felt like he was ashamed to be in the room. I gripped the back of the nearest chair because my legs had stopped working properly and I needed something solid to hold onto. I kept waiting for Daniel to turn around and tell me this was some terrible misunderstanding. He didn't turn around. He sat there staring at the table, unable to look at his pregnant wife, and then he turned to the man at the head of the table and started begging. Please, he said, one more chance, one more game. I'll win it all back, I swear it. Kang Ji-ho set down his cards. He folded his hands on the table and looked at Daniel for a long quiet moment, and then he looked at me, and this time he didn't look away quickly. He looked at me the way nobody else in that room had, not like a problem, not like collateral, not like a consequence of someone else's disaster. He looked at me like I was a person standing in the middle of a nightmare, and like that was something that actually mattered to him. His eyes moved to my stomach. Just briefly, and something crossed his face, small and fast, gone almost before it appeared, but I caught it. And I didn't understand it yet, but I felt it. She's pregnant, Ji-ho said. He said it flatly, like a fact being entered into a record that could not be altered. Daniel said nothing. That silence was louder than anything he could have said. I felt the mood of the entire room shift around me, not dramatically but unmistakably, like the temperature had dropped. Because even men who lived in the spaces between rules had lines, and Daniel had just crossed one in front of all of them. My tears came without sound. I didn't sob. I didn't make a scene. They just slipped down my face because I had finally stopped arguing with what I had known for months. My husband was not going to save us. He was going to save himself. We were just the last thing he had left to spend. Ji-ho's voice went quieter, colder. You brought your pregnant wife into this room and offered her as a debt payment, he said. It wasn't a question. Daniel's voice cracked. I had no choice, he said. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Ji-ho looked at him for one more moment. You made choices, he said. Every day for months you made choices. Tonight is only where they brought you. And then he stood up. It was a simple thing, a man rising from a chair, but every person in that room felt it. Guards who had been relaxed became alert without being told. Men at the table adjusted their posture. The entire energy of the room reorganized itself around the fact of his movement. That was power, not loud, not performed, just real. Ji-ho walked around the table slowly and stopped in front of me. I held my breath. My mind was still somewhere back in the moment Daniel had said the words, still trying to catch up to the reality of where I was and what had just happened. But Ji-ho didn't touch me. He reached up and removed his suit jacket and placed it over my shoulders, carefully, the way you handle something that deserves to be handled with care. The fabric was warm and it smelled clean, and the gesture was so unexpectedly gentle that it broke something open in my chest. He looked at me for one quiet moment. Then he turned back to Daniel. She is leaving, he said. Daniel jumped to his feet. She is my wife. Ji-ho looked at him. Then you should have remembered that before tonight. One of his men appeared at my side, not grabbing, just present, gidding, and I let myself be moved toward the door. I looked back at Daniel once. He was watching me go. He still couldn't meet my eyes. That was the moment I stopped being his wife in my heart. Everything that came after was just paperwork. Outside, Seoul was deep in autumn rain, the kind that comes down heavy and total, soaking everything immediately, turning the Gangnam streets into long mirrors of reflected light. I stood under the entrance canopy and shook, not from cold, from the accumulated weight of what had just happened. My husband had offered me as collateral across a gambling table, 6 months pregnant, and the only person who had stopped it was a stranger, a man everyone feared, a man who owed me absolutely nothing. Ji-ho came outside a few minutes later, a different jacket on now, and stood beside me looking out at the rain. His car was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Black, silent, exactly what you would expect. I turned to look at him. "Why?" I said. He glanced at me. "Why what? Why are you helping me?" I said. "You don't know me. I'm nothing to you. I'm just the wife of a man who owes you money." He was quiet for a moment. The rain kept falling in steady curtains across the street. And then he said, "Because 10 years ago someone should have helped my mother." The words arrived quietly, but they landed with weight. Something moved through his eyes when he said it, old and painful and carefully managed, there for less than a second before his face went still again. But I had seen it. And in that moment the most powerful man in the room became someone else entirely. He became a son who had watched a woman suffer and never forgiven himself for being unable to stop it. He became someone who had turned that grief into a rule he never broke. I didn't say anything. There were no words that fit. He opened the car door himself. "I'll have you taken somewhere safe tonight," he said. "You shouldn't go back to the apartment." I thought about my daughter growing inside me, and I got in the car. As Ji-ho moved to close the door, his phone vibrated. He read the screen without expression, a message from his head of security. "Boss, we ran background on the husband as instructed." He read it. A second message followed immediately. "The pregnancy timeline doesn't match his travel records. He was out of the country for 4 months. The dates don't line up." Ji-ho stood very still in the rain. Then he raised his eyes slowly and looked at me through the car window. I was sitting in the back seat holding my coat over my stomach, staring out at the wet city, completely unaware. Something moved through his face that I would only understand much later. Not judgment, not suspicion, something quieter. A question he was not going to ask that night. He closed the door gently. He replied to his security team. And then he did the thing that told me more about who he was than anything else that had happened. He said nothing. He simply walked to the front of the car, spoke to his driver, and watched the car pull into the rain. Because whatever the truth was, it was not his to take from me that night. I was taken to a private residence in Yongsan, clean and quiet and tasteful, nothing excessive but nothing missing either. A woman named Ji-yeon, Ji-ho's personal assistant, was already there. She was calm and efficient and made no awkward reference to anything that had happened. She showed me to a room, told me I could stay as long as I needed, and left me alone. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time and looked at the wall. Then I called my mother in Atlanta. I couldn't tell her everything. I said Daniel and I were having serious problems and I needed time to figure things out. She said, "Grace, come home." Part of me wanted to go immediately. But I was 6 months pregnant and alone in a foreign city with no money of my own because Daniel had controlled every account we shared, and something I could not yet name was asking me to stay. When I woke the next morning, there was breakfast outside my door. A small note beside it, printed and formal. "If you need anything, use this number. KJH, 3 letters, Kang Ji-ho." I folded the note and put it in my coat pocket and did not call for 4 days. On the 5th day, Ji-yeon mentioned that Ji-ho had asked whether I needed anything specific for the pregnancy. Vitamins, medical appointments, anything at all. I said I was fine. On the 6th day, I called my doctor in Mapogu, and when I arrived at the clinic, the bill had already been settled. I came back to the residence and called the number. He answered on the 2nd ring. "You didn't have to pay for my appointment," I said. A pause. "I know," he said. "I don't want to be a burden to you," I said. Another pause longer. "You are not," he said. And then quietly, "How are you feeling, Grace? Not how is the situation, not what are your plans, how are you feeling?" And I burst into tears right there on the phone, not because I was falling apart, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone ask me that and actually mean it. He didn't fill the silence. He just waited. And when I could speak again, I said, "I don't know what I'm doing. I'm pregnant and I'm alone in a city that isn't mine and I don't know what comes next." He said, "You don't have to know yet," that was all. But it was enough. 2 weeks later, he came to the residence in person. I had only seen him in the casino and the rain outside it, both of which were extreme circumstances that made everyone look different. In daylight, in a simple dark coat, carrying 2 coffees from the shop at the end of the street, he looked more human. Still controlled, still quiet, but human. We sat across from each other in the small living room, and he didn't make small talk because he was not a man who did that. He said, "I know something, and I want you to know that I know it, not to use against you, but because I don't want there to be anything hidden between us." And he told me about the pregnancy timeline, about what his security team had found. I set down my coffee. The room felt very small, and then I told him the truth, because I was tired of being convenient, because sitting across from someone who had given me more dignity in 2 weeks than my husband had in 3 years made honesty feel possible for the first time in a long time. I told him that Daniel had been disappearing long before I knew about the gambling. That there had been someone else, briefly, honestly, a man I had met at a work conference who had seen me when Daniel had stopped looking. It ended before I even knew I was pregnant. And when I found out, I had told myself the baby was Daniel's because I didn't know how to face the alternative. "I don't know who her father is," I said, not with certainty. "But I know she is mine, and I love her, and I would do anything in this world for her." Ji-ho was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That is the only thing that matters." He said it like he meant it completely. And something shifted between us that afternoon, slowly, carefully, like the first light after a very long night. Daniel called 3 weeks after the casino. He sounded smaller, deflated, like the performance he had been maintaining for years had finally run out of energy. "Grace, I'm sorry," he said. "I had waited so long to hear those words. And now that they had arrived, they meant absolutely nothing at all." "I know," I said, "but sorry doesn't change what happened." He said he wanted to try again, that he was getting help, that he loved me and the baby. I listened to every word without interrupting. And when he finished, I said, "Daniel, the baby might not be yours." Silence. Long and complete. "I know," he finally said. I blinked. "You knew." "I suspected," he said quietly. "For a while, but I was afraid to ask, afraid to lose you." And yet he had put me on a table as collateral without a second of hesitation. The contradiction of it hit me somewhere deep, and I had to press my hand to my chest to hold myself steady. "I need you to sign the divorce papers," I said. He started to argue. "Daniel," I said, "it is over. Please let me leave with some dignity." He went quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Okay," 1 word, and 3 years of marriage ended just like that. The months that followed were the quietest, most healing months of my life. Ji-ho did not rush anything. He did not announce feelings or make grand romantic declarations. He showed up in small, consistent ways that meant more than any performance could have. He remembered that I didn't like cilantro and made sure Ji-ho noted it when food was ordered. He sent books in English when he noticed I was running out of things to read. He called every few days, short calls, simple questions. "How are you feeling? Did you sleep? Is there anything you need?" One afternoon he arrived to take me to a prenatal appointment because Ji-yeon was unavailable, and he said, with complete seriousness, "You should not go alone." So there I was, walking into a Seoul maternity clinic alongside the most quietly powerful man in the city, who then sat in the waiting area and read a medical brochure about 3rd trimester nutrition with the focused expression of someone preparing for an important exam. I almost laughed out loud. Instead, I watched him from across the room and felt something warm move through my chest that I told myself firmly to ignore. My heart, as it turned out, was not listening. One evening he told me about his father. We were sitting on the small terrace of the residence, and it came out slowly, the way old pain does when someone finally trusts you enough to let it. His father had been a gambler. The real kind, the kind who burned through everything and always came back with promises and charm, and just enough love to make you stay. His mother had stayed. Through the debts and the humiliation and the years of waiting for a man to become the person she believed he could be. She died waiting. Ji-ho had been 23 years old. He told me without drama, just facts organized into something manageable, the voice of a man who had spent a long time learning how to carry something that had no good place to be put down. "I never want to see another woman look the way she looked," he said, "like she is waiting to be chosen by someone who already decided she doesn't matter." I said, "That's why you stood up that night." He looked at me. "Part of it," he said. Part of it was something else. He didn't say what. He didn't need to. I already understood. My daughter arrived on a cold December morning. She came quietly into the world, taking her time, like she was making sure she was ready. When the nurse placed her in my arms, everything that had happened in the past months collapsed into one single point of perfect clarity. She was mine. Completely and entirely and without condition mine. I named her Adiz. It was an Igbo name that meant daughter of a king. Because whatever she came from, wherever she was going, she deserved to know from the very beginning that she was royalty. Ji-ho was in the waiting area. I hadn't asked him to come. Ji-yeon had mentioned the hospital in passing and he had simply appeared, no explanation, no announcement, just present the way he always was. When the nurse brought him in after I was settled, he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the baby in my arms, and something happened to his face that I had never seen before. Something soft and unguarded and entirely real. He walked over slowly. "She is perfect," he said. I looked up at him in that terrible fluorescent hospital light with my daughter in my arms and the whole world going on outside as normal, and I understood something I hadn't let myself think until that moment. This man had chosen us, long before either of us had put words to any of it. He asked me on an ordinary Thursday. Adiz was 3 months old. I had moved into a proper apartment, one Ji-ho had helped me find without ever making me feel like I was being managed or taken care of against my will. I had started teaching English online to Korean students, small income but mine, built by my own hands. The divorce had been finalized 2 months earlier. Daniel had signed quietly and gone back to whatever version of his life existed without me in it. I was standing at the kitchen counter making tea when Ji-ho came in. He sat at the table and I brought 2 cups over and sat across from him the way we had done dozens of times by then. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at me. "I want to ask you something and I need you to take your time before you answer," he said. He said, "I know who I am. I know what my life looks like and the reputation that follows me everywhere I go. I know I am not a simple man and that choosing me would not be a simple life." He paused. "But I also know that since the night I met you I have not been the same. And I know that Adiz deserves someone who will be here, fully, without reservation, for as long as she needs. I want to be that person if you will allow it." He reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table between us. A ring, small and elegant. A thin gold band with a single stone that caught the kitchen light. Not a performance, just a question. I stared at it. Then I looked at him. The man who had walked into the worst night of my life and refused to let it swallow me. The man who read prenatal brochures in waiting rooms and sent books in English and called to ask how I was sleeping. The man who had trusted me with his mother and his grief and the most honest part of himself. My eyes filled. I said, "You know I come with complications." He almost smiled, one of the rare ones that reached his eyes. "I know," he said, "I am not asking for a simple answer." And I said yes. We married in spring. Small and private, a garden ceremony in the hills above Seoul where the cherry blossoms had just begun to open, pink and weightless in the warm air. My mother flew in from Atlanta and spent most of the ceremony holding Adiz and crying steadily. Ji-yeon was there, a small circle of people who mattered, no grand production, no performance, just 2 people who had found each other in the rubble of a terrible night and built something real out of what came after. When it was time for vows, Ji-ho looked at me and said, "I see you, Grace, all of you, and I am not going anywhere." I said, "You were the most unexpected thing that ever happened to me. And I am grateful for you every single day." Adiz, in my mother's arms, chose that exact moment to make a sound, some small insistent noise that made everyone laugh. And Ji-ho, the man nobody in Seoul dared to disrespect, looked at my daughter, and his whole face became something open and gentle and undefended that I had only ever seen in private. He held out one finger toward her. She grabbed it immediately and held on with the absolute certainty of someone who had already decided this person belonged to her. I think about that casino night sometimes, not with bitterness anymore, more like you think about a storm that passed and changed the landscape completely. I think about the woman I was standing in that room, pregnant and terrified, and understanding for the first time that the person she had followed across the world had never truly seen her at all. I think about how close I came to letting that night be the thing that defined me. And then I think about everything that came after. A man who stood up not because he was required to, but because something inside him simply would not allow him to stay seated. A man who gave me his jacket in the rain and asked for nothing in return. A man who showed up in small ways day after day until the small ways became a whole life. People ask me what it is like to be married to Kang Ji-ho. I tell them it is quiet, steady, safe. Not because nothing difficult ever happens, but because when difficult things happen I do not face them alone anymore. Adiz is 2 years old now. She calls him Appa, Daddy. She runs to him when she hears his key in the door and he catches her every single time with the same expression on his face, like she's the most extraordinary thing he has ever seen. And maybe she is. Maybe we both are to him. I used to believe that love was supposed to feel like electricity. Breathless and unstable and always on the edge of something. Now I know that real love feels like this. Like someone choosing you on an ordinary Thursday with 2 cups of tea on the table. Like someone asking how you slept. Like someone who sees all of you, the complicated parts and the uncertain parts and the parts that are still healing, and says I am not going anywhere. Like someone choosing you again and again and again, quietly, without needing anything back. Every single day.